Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Justin Blake, Executive Director of the Edelman Trust Institute, Edelman's global research center and learning laboratory dedicated to the study and building of trust across institutions. This week, we're discussing the Infodemic and insights from Edelman's recently released 2022 Trust Barometer. To speak more on this, I'm joined by Vivian Schiller, Executive Director of Aspen Digital at the Aspen Institute. Vivian is an accomplished executive spanning the worlds of journalism, media, and technology. She has held roles at some of the most respected media organizations in the world, including NPR, the New York Times, NBC News, Discovery, and CNN. Vivian, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, let's get into it. Edelman just released the findings of our 2022 Trust Barometer, and it shows that the infodemic is only growing. Media remains the least trusted institution. 76% of respondents are worried about false information being used as a weapon, and an overwhelming majority of respondents believe journalists are trying to mislead people, not a rosy picture of your former profession. What is driving this lack of trust in media?
Well, frankly, some of it is well-deserved. Well, first of all, let's parse those two different data points that you put out there because they're distinct. The first one about concerns about mis and disinformation is very well placed. There is a tsunami of mis and disinformation that is being put out to the public and circulating among the public, often by the public, through all kinds of channels, whether it is social media, whether it's in private messaging, chat groups, coming from certain talk radio or television. So there's a concern about disinformation. I would be concerned if people weren't concerned, because it's a big problem. The second one about declining trust in the media. I mean, let's start with the word media. I don't know what the media is. I honestly don't know what that word means, because it is so broad as to encompass, quite, serious journalistic enterprises, but also any, Jane, Dick, and Harry out there who wants to spew their opinions or falsehoods out into the ether by any means necessary. All of those people are the media to someone, and a lot of it is bad media. When I'm saying bad media, I mean either I mean actors who are, I don't mean like thespians, but actors who, for reasons of either ideology or profit or power, have decided they want to spread information that is false and often harmful. And it could be about anything from the efficacy of vaccines to how COVID is spread or cured. It could be about who was whether there was widespread fraud in the November 2020 election, to climate change. You have it. So that is infecting populations, absolutely. Is it infecting good media? I would say no. I would say there's a different set of issues, which frankly are not at the same level. I'm going to do what a lot of bad media and even good media does, which is to try to avoid here false equivalencies, because outright lying and putting dangerous information out there is not the same as what I'm about to say, which is a lot of very responsible media is having trouble meeting the moment insofar as long-standing journalistic norms about the way you report on public officials and what it means to be impartial are a lot of those organizations are struggling with those norms that maybe need to evolve to meet the unprecedented times that we're in. So I'm happy to go in depth on either of those, but that's really what I'm doing.
Yeah, well, why don't we talk a little bit about where you finished? Like, what should media be doing to evolve its norms?
Okay, so again, by media here, I'm going to talk about responsible journalism, organizations that their motivation is the public interest, who may sometimes get things wrong, but are intending to serve the public, to help the public be informed and make responsible decisions as citizens. So everything I'm talking about is about that cohort of news organizations. So where a lot of news organizations are struggling is with trying to figure out how to address an era of unprecedented polarization where elected officials or others who yield tremendous influence, including from the White House, consistently spew falsehoods and lies. And it's very difficult for news organizations who are used to reporting on what a public official says, and yes, correcting it, but basically putting those words out there as the primary information to citizens, to sort of change course and say, wait a minute, just reporting on the words, say, of a President Trump, when he talks about hydroxychloroquine as a cure, for example, I'm using a slightly old example here, for COVID, that reporting on that, even just repeating those words can be dangerous to public health. It sometimes is about how to report on the words of the growing number of members of Congress who think that the election was stolen, and whether in sort of a time-honored fashion of giving both sides equal time or having their say, whether it's appropriate to give someone a say when that say is not based on any kind of evidence whatsoever, or the kind of tweets and headlines you put out there that can be misleading. I would also say they're struggling with, what does it mean to be impartial? So when I was raised as a journalist, we were taught we don't stand for anything. We don't stand for anything. But maybe in 2022, news organizations need to stand for democracy. Maybe they need to stand for the truth. Maybe they need to stand for science. And these are some of the norms that are changing and that need to change.
And in terms of these changing norms for what you call responsible media, can you think of an example of where a media organization or a member of media has risen to the occasion and has adapted effectively for these times?
Yeah, I'll give a recent example, and frankly, he got a lot of praise for it. So Steve Inskeep, the NPR host, recently did an interview with Trump. I think this was just sometime in mid-January, roughly. And rather than put the interview out live, what they did was they recorded the interview, and then they prefaced the interview with contextual information about what the conversation was going to be about, and information that put, and Trump put out a lot of false information in this interview, sort of talked about the context, ran the interview, and then talked again about what Trump said that was false and what the actual facts say. So this is sometimes dubbed the truth sandwich. This is not my idea. It's a really good way of addressing falsehoods, because he's the former president of the United States. What he says matters. He may be a candidate and may be president again. You don't want to ignore his words. You have to report on them. But you make the truth sandwich. So think of the two pieces of the bread are the actual evidence-based reality. The meat in the middle is in this case, what Trump said, but you surround that meat, which is, again, some of these false statements with, today, former President Trump misspoke about, whatever, what he talked about. Then you have his words, and then you say, actually, the reality is hydroxychloroquine it's not been proven to cure COVID. Here are things that do. That's just an example.
Yeah, I love the truth sandwich. Let's circle back then to the other side of the equation, the kind of less responsible media or people acting as media. In our survey, we found that 76% of respondents are worried about fake news being used as a weapon. And a lot of the examples that people think of as fake news are things that might attack a government agency or official, for example. But should corporations be worried about fake news being used against them?
Well, first of all, I don't really love the term fake news because it really has lost meaning and has sort of, if it has any meaning, it's come to mean things that I don't agree with. So, we'd like to try to be very specific about misinformation or disinformation, two distinct, really intentionality is really the main difference. Do corporations need to be concerned about mis and disinformation? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first of all, as the latest trust index has indicated, CEOs and corporate leaders have some of the highest trust levels, not just in the United States, but around the world. And with that trust, with great power, with great power comes great responsibilities. So corporate leaders, therefore, do have a responsibility to take that trust and use it responsibly. And by, first of all, not spreading falsehoods themselves through, if we think about sort of, through owned media, and most don't, to be fair, but also to think about how, corporations are the economic engine of the platforms because they are advertiser based. To think about how they want to use their hard-earned revenue and marketing dollars with whom, and whether it is with platforms, whether it's talk radio or OAN or YouTube, how they want to use their money and whether they want to put it behind entities that have been shown to be irresponsible with information. I would further say that corporations better be prepared to be targets of misinformation or disinformation themselves, because if it hasn't come for them, it's coming. And that can impact not only stock price and CEO reputation, but can harm consumer confidence and be a risk, to long-term sustainability of these companies and trust.
Yeah. You talked earlier about business kind of stepping up at this moment when it's the most trusted institution and what it can do to support more responsible media. You talked a little bit about how they can change their ad spend, for example, as one of the things, taking it away from platforms that are spreading misinformation. What are some of the other things that business can do to help reliable, credible information spread? And are there any examples that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, yes, to use their voice, either the CEO's own. I mean, CEOs themselves are sort of have long been significant influencers in their own right, and the brands and the individual brands themselves have, many of them have cachet. So both brand voice and the CEO voice is very important in terms of standing up for what's right. We talked earlier about how news organizations have a responsibility, I believe, to stand for some things these days, one of them being democracy. I think that corporations should stand for democracy as well. And in some cases that may be speaking out about anti-democratic practices. For example, speaking out against those who would sow mistrust in the electoral system, speaking out against those who would seek to disenfranchise underrepresented communities by making it harder to vote. I do think, and your study shows, in fact, that consumers, the public, want to see corporate leaders take a stand on important issues, and so do employees. Employees, as we well know, have become a much more significant stakeholder, in recent years than they ever have been previously. And with the war on talent, not the war on talent, the war for talent, very big difference. The war for talent these days, hopefully not the war on talent. That really matters.
Yeah, but corporations and CEOs need to walk a fine line here, though, right? Like, people do want them to take a stand on societal issues, but they get very nervous about corporations and their leaders taking a stand on electoral issues or issues that seem to go into politics. So you raised this really interesting point about voting rights, for example. And there were certainly a number of corporations that after January 6th of last year made statements and took some actions related to voting rights. Where do companies draw the line and how do they start making some of these decisions?
I think you use the word politics, and I would differentiate politics from the instruments of democracy. Those are two different things. Politics is a dangerous territory for any CEO to wade in on. Taking a position on a specific candidates or on sort of the political day in and day out. That is very different than the instruments of democracy, which include making sure that citizens get the information that they need to be responsible voters, making sure that they have access to voting, which means giving, frankly, employees the time off they need to vote, because voting in this country is on a Tuesday instead of on the weekend, which would make it a lot easier for people. Standing up for drop boxes, mail-in voting, extended hours for voting, all of these things, which frankly are under attack in many communities because certain politicians believe that by suppressing the vote, that will better serve their purposes. So those are two different things.
Yeah, well, voting information is a really interesting topic because one of the things that we found is people trust their own employer, information from their own employer, more than information from any other source, including media or government. So with people trusting information from their own employer, you could see a world where employers being very clear about voting information, but other things such as like the ever-changing COVID health guidance. So with this potential role for employers, what sort of information should they be giving out to their own employee base? And should this be a bigger part of what business does, is really like providing important, credible information?
Yeah, it has to be, but carefully. So, we talked about access to voting. So there are plenty of completely neutral, nonpartisan databases of how to figure out where you should vote, when the registration deadlines are, when early voting starts, when early voting stops, all of that kind of thing. And I think it is essential for employers to provide that information. They don't have to start from scratch and build their own databases. That is available. In other topics, it's a little more difficult. When it comes to COVID, most employers, and frankly, I don't know that there is a better way, are relying on CDC information. There needs to be some kind of, baseline of what kind of guidelines we're looking at collectively. And I know the CDC is under attack in certain quarters, and they've maybe, struggled a little bit with their communication, but it's the best we've got right now. So it really depends. But again, that's providing guidance to employees about things that they need to live their life, how to stay safe from COVID, how to vote. That's a little bit different than sort of making bold statements, from the CEO's corner office, or having brands, stand for certain values. Those are two different sets of issues, both equally as important, I think.
Yeah, and if, trying to give advice to corporate leaders who are trying to give the most credible information to their employees, how do you vet that? If this is based on government information, which people trust less anyway, is there a certain position within a company that should be vetting that information? How do you make sure that you are getting the credible information to employees and that it's information that they will trust?
Honestly, I think certain institutions need that trust boost, which a company can provide. So let's come back to the CDC. Again, I recognize there have been some communication issues, and frankly, the science of COVID is fast moving. So it's impossible for any organization, of course you're going to change your guidance based on current conditions. I would say it is beholden on corporations to provide C2C information and therefore building trust for an institution that needs to be trusted for public health reasons. And not to go out and try to do your own research. That's frankly, that's how we got in this mess to begin with. You don't want to do your own research. We're not scientists. Corporations are not scientists. I know that they employ advisors, and that's great. But I think that's a case where it's important to build up that trust level.
Yeah, totally agree that one of the roles of business right now is this now responsibility to help other important institutions gain trust. And how do you partner with them, share information credibly to help them accrue to higher trust?
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Commission on Information Disorder. This is a report and a commission led by Aspen Digital, and it has 3 goals: increase transparency, reducing harm, and building trust. So I think let's talk a little bit about some of the commission findings around building trust during the infodemic.
Sure. So just to back up just a little bit. So the commission was, Aspen Digital is the program that I run at the Aspen Institute, and we focus on the intersection of media, the internet, technology, and society. So we put together a commission of 15 experts from all kinds of disciplines. It was bipartisan, and it was researchers, philanthropists, First Amendment experts, politicians, you name it. And they did 6 months, 7 months of intensive work and came out with a set of recommendations that were, again, bucketed under those 3 things you talked about, which is increasing transparency, reducing harms, and building trust. So the recommendations under building trust really all of it's almost irresponsible for me just to talk about those recommendations, because all of the recommendations do sort of intersect with each other, but they have to do with some of the recommendations specifically. One of them, for example, is specifically about accountability norms, which we talked about a little bit earlier in our conversations, which is how do you promote new norms that create personal and professional consequences within communities and networks for individuals who willfully violate the public trust and use their privilege to harm the public. So, examples here would be how should professional organizations like medical associations, should they be holding their members accountable when they share false health information with the public, often for profit? Can advertisers, should they be withholding? This is where, CMOs come in. Withhold advertising from platforms whose practices fail to protect their consumers from harmful misinformation. It comes also journalists, what we spoke about earlier. So that was one of the recommendations. Another of the recommendations for building trust was about the collapse of local news outlets, really, which have just been decimated in the last 15 years, and especially in the last 2 years under COVID, to help promote substantial long-term investment in local journalism that helps inform and empower citizens. Another recommendation is about what we call healthy digital discourse. So the commission endorses the development of communication tools, networks, and platforms that are designed to bring us together and create healthier discourse and trust. So these are just some of the recommendations about building trust. Throughout the entire report, there are other recommendations. Some of them are aimed at the platforms to make sure that they provide the info, they are disclose their content moderation policies in more detail, that they publish information about their most high reach accounts, particularly those that spread information, transparency around advertising. Again, this impacts the corporate world, requiring platforms to disclose information about all paid ads and paid promoted posts on their platforms. And then there's other recommendations for Congress and regulators.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the 3 recommendations that you mentioned earlier. And I'm particularly curious for examples of some best practices here and who's doing it well. So in terms of accountability norms, is there a company that you've seen that's kind of risen to the occasion in terms of what they've done, in terms of where they're putting their money, or other related examples?
Yeah, I do see some. I've seen more, brands, for lack of a better word, sort of standing out and standing up for for certain principles, but not necessarily all of the big ones. And I'd love to see a little more. I would like to see a little bit more boldness there in terms of actions that they can take to cause consequences for those norms. I mean, the best example, you mentioned it earlier, is that a number of different companies said we are going to withhold, PAC money for those members of Congress who refused to certify the election and refused to acknowledge that our current president, President Biden, is the rightful winner of the 2020 election. I think that is a perfect example of a role that companies can play in norms. Now, unfortunately, some of them have sort of they made those statements quite boldly. Some of them have now not so boldly and quite quietly began giving to some of those politicians again, even though those politicians have not changed their tune. So, this is where the concerns are: is consistency. There have to be consequences for bad behavior. That's the glue that holds society together.
Well, another norm, in knowing that a lot of our listeners are CMOs or folks that work in marketing, is where do you spend your ad money and your ad dollars? And I wonder if you've seen some good examples there, or if you just have some advice in that area.
Yeah, it's easier to say where you should not spend your ad money. Don't put your ad money behind liars. I mean, there's just no other, and there's a lot of liars out there, and some of them are on very well distributed cable networks. Don't spend your money there, and that may seem. And don't spend your money on digital, either on radio outlets or digital platforms that do the same. Now, the trick is a lot of, as your listeners will well know, a lot of times ad money goes, it goes through, ad tech against certain targets. And so even though a brand may not choose to be, having their ads on, I'm a big fat liar.com, obviously not a real site, at least as far as I know, their ads may end up there through ad networks. And so, I think for CMOs to sort of demand greater transparency and action on behalf of ad networks to make sure that doesn't happen is going to be vital. Otherwise, you could be inadvertently funding bad actors, even if you don't intend to.
It's good advice. It's good advice. You talked about the collapse of local news. Is there a role that business should be playing to help prop up local news? Yes,
absolutely. They can support local news through whatever what local news there is. Support those entities through, depending on what their revenue model. So it could be advertising, it could be sponsorship, it could be donations, it could be various forms of contribution, or just spreading the word about these responsible outlets. There are small news organizations that are struggling and to fill news deserts, and so there absolutely is a role because they need to be funded.
Great. I love these very practical tips as we finish up. And I guess the last question for you is, I don't know how we're going to turn this one into a positive, but you talked about healthy digital discourse. And right now, trust in social media stands at 37%, down 8 points from last year. Are you seeing any example, any hope in terms of building healthy digital discourse?
Yeah. I mean, there are some projects that are out there that do, bring people together across differences and try to increase understanding. And to the extent that corporations, can support them, some of them come out of MIT and other entities who are doing, very interesting experiments that are, scalable, potentially scalable experiments to get people in communities talking to each other. Part of the problem with local news collapsing is it also is a way for people to come together around, in their community around, around different topics. So if news is collapsing, then we need those other experiments. And, you say, I'm giving quite specific tactical advice, which, none of which, even I'll add it all together, none of these things are going to solve the problem, but what's the alternative? We just give up? We have to keep chipping away at it, community by community, person by person, because even if no individual tactic can solve the crisis that we're in, collectively, we can make a dent. So I'm going to turn it into a positive.
That is a great positive. And I also just think that, specifics aside, business changing its orientation so that it sees part of its responsibility helping the institution of media gain credibility and ensuring that there is credible information is an important role of business.
Is a huge burden and a huge bonus. And so use that trust.
Indeed. Vivian, thanks so much for sharing your ideas and your insights today and coming on to our podcast. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.